Hello, this is me trying to get back on the horse with making videos again. It's been a while. This one is about a question that I've gotten a lot, having worked on two games, Dishonored 2 and Tactical Breach Wizards. These are really different games in terms of genre. One of them is a big AAA stealth thing, and the other one is an indie tactics game. But two things they have in common are that they allow the player to kind of upgrade their characters with lots of very different powers. And also, with those powers, they encourage you to play the levels in very different ways and kind of come up with your own solutions and stuff like that. So the question is, how do you make levels, one level or lots of levels, that allow the player to play in lots of different ways when you don't know which upgrades and powers the player has chosen, and therefore you don't know what they can do? Because in Dishonored 2, for example, you can choose to play as Corvo or Emily, and they have completely different power sets. And not only that, but you can also choose, unlike in Dishonored 1, you can choose to reject the outsider. When you meet him and he offers to give you these crazy powers, you can say, no, I don't want them. Which means that you play through the entire game with no powers in a game that is kind of all about having these crazy powers, right? So that's kind of bonkers. And then in Breach Wizards, you have a squad of wizards who you upgrade, who are already fundamentally kind of orthogonal and different in their ability sets and stuff, but then you can upgrade them with more perks and stuff that make them even more different. So that might sound like it would be a nightmare to make levels for these games. If you don't know what powers the player has chosen, how do you make levels to kind of take advantage of those powers, or that can't be broken by having those powers and all this kind of thing? But the answer, in my opinion, in my experience on these particular games, and I say that because, other games will be different. There's some other things about these games which is relevant, which I'll get into later. But in my experience working on these games, it's simpler than it sounds. And I think this is important to talk about because the bad way of making levels to accommodate all these powers, in my opinion, would be to make levels that are essentially 7 levels in one, where you've made kind of a route. And this is a very common thing. I think when people think about non-linearity in level design and designing for lots of different powers and playstyles and stuff, a lot of people kind of assume that it means designing a different route where you go this way and there's that kind of gameplay there, and then you design a second route where there's this kind of gameplay there, like the stealthy one or the combat one or whatever. But to me, this doesn't really make sense and is the bad way to do it because A, it's just inefficient and it's loads of work to make just 2 levels basically instead of 1. And B, it doesn't really make sense in a stealth game where stealth that goes wrong can turn into combat. Designing the stealth route is also designing a combat route because you don't know how it's going to go. And C, what's the other thing? What is it? Oh, and that's it. C, the other thing is that it's just not as cool. If you design 2 different levels for different playstyles, it's not as interesting as designing one level that can be played in multiple ways. That's the whole appeal and the cool thing about it. And so you're kind of sidestepping that coolness if you just make 2 separate levels for different playstyles. So anyway, that's not what you do. You don't make non-linearity and different playstyles doesn't mean you just make multiple levels in the same level. My approach to this was kind of more of the opposite, and not actually thinking about loads of specific routes and ideas specific to different powers. I generally approach both of these games just by making the levels and the situations and stuff so that they would work regardless of which powers you have, right? Because obviously, if you don't know which powers the player has, then you can't design the level to require any powers that they might not have and leave them stuck. Obviously, you can't do that. But in general, my approach was to design most of the situations to basically just work with the core gameplay of the game and then consider all of the cool extra things the player can do as just bonuses, right? And obviously I would think about cool extra little things and what about if the player has blink and, how would they play it with that? I think about that, of course, but ultimately all of the levels should be designed for the core gameplay of the game. You obviously think about whether the player could break things or, just have a completely shortcut things in a way that you don't want if they have certain powers. But I'm definitely not designing loads of different ideas and situations for different powers. And to me, there's a couple of reasons why this works. Even in Dishonored 2, where there's a huge gulf between a player who has upgraded all of their powers as Corvo or Emily and another player who has rejected the powers from the outsider and can not do any of them. I remember when when it was kind of announced to the team that was going to be a thing, that they could just reject the powers. And I thought, well, that's crazy. That's going to be a nightmare for us level designers to kind of take into account. But really, it wasn't in the end. And I was actually really surprised, pleasantly surprised, because, you know, all it really took to make sure that a player could play the levels with no powers, in the end, the only things I remember doing is adding a few crates under certain ledges and stuff that normally a player would blink to, and just making sure that they can climb up instead if they don't have powers. So basically my approach was to focus on the core gameplay, whether that was the core abilities of the wizards in Tactical Breach Wizards or the basic kind of thiefy style stealth in Dishonored, and just design for that, and then consider everything else as gravy and extra stuff. But I think another reason why this works is it's about game design as well. Some of this stuff is solved or made easier by the way the game design is approached. And I think there's two sides to this. One of them is that both of these games, the core difficulty is not that high, and it's not really about just the game being hard. Both of these games, as I've talked about this recently in my GDC talk about the level design work I did on Breach Wizards, that should go on YouTube soon, I hope. I talked about how in both of these games, the goal of the gameplay, the experience is about kind of encouraging the player to experiment with all these interesting powers, right? And come up with their own ways of combining them in interesting ways and stuff like this. And the thing about when you design for that kind of game, you can't make it super hard, because for the player to feel like they can be creative and try things out and experiment, they need to feel like there's space to do that and they're kind of safe to experiment, and as opposed to being kind of super under pressure and kind of with a gun to their head, because you don't experiment if you're really under pressure. That's the thing. So neither of these games are super difficult at their core. In the case of Breach Wizards, we deliberately made it quite easy at its core, and we let you skip the levels and all kinds of stuff because we just don't want you getting stuck. But instead of making the games fundamentally difficult, we make the base level kind of easier than maybe an average game might be, but then we come up with lots of ways to let you opt into more difficult ways to play the game if you want to. And that has all kinds of benefits in terms of accessibility and just letting more people enjoy the game in their own way. But also it means that it kind of takes some of the pressure off you as a level designer to make sure that everything's always the right level of difficulty, right? So for example, you know, I suppose an easy case is in the case of Dishonored 2, where you can turn down the powers. We hope it's clear to players that if you do that, obviously the game is going to be harder because you have less powers, right? And because the player has opted into it, it's kind of on them. And so as a level designer, I don't think I remember thinking about how hard it is without the powers. You know, I tested it a bit and I realized, oh, it's not that different. And maybe I might have, you know, removed an enemy or two to make a stealth situation a bit less tight and intense, to give a bit more space and breathing room for a player with no powers to play it. But it kind of worked as it was. But I didn't have to worry about it too much because I knew that that mode is the player opting into a difficult way of playing the game. And in Breach Wizards, like I say, it's quite a story-driven game for a tactics game, so we wanted players to just be able to breeze through the game in a way and never get stuck. But because we're introducing so much new stuff all the time, with the enemy design and the level designs all being kind of unique and stuff, you know, we could get away with not being very challenging and just keep things interesting by constantly letting the player try out new things. And therefore, again, I didn't think about the difficulty of all the different ways the player can play the level, because so long as they can do something interesting, I don't mind if it's easy. And I think it's good. If it's easy but interesting, it's still interesting. So yeah, the fact that these games didn't stress difficulty as the reason for playing the game or the reason why it's fun, that helps. I mean, like I said, it helps the creative kind of gameplay that I talked about in both these games, but also it takes some pressure off the level designer to kind of get it right all the time in terms of difficulty, because it's, in the end, the experience becomes a much more fluid thing where the player is deciding how to play the game and therefore kind of deciding their own difficulty level to some degree. Anyway, so that's why my approach to making levels for these games, which might sound really complicated, trying to think about how you design a level for all these different possibilities and different player abilities that they may or may not have, all this stuff. That might sound really difficult, but in reality it's not, or wasn't it for these games. Because, like I say, of all these things that mean that you don't really have to think about all those details all the time. Obviously, it's cool to come up with cool ideas for things the player can do when they do have these powers. That's cool. But at its base, you're always designing for the core gameplay. And if the game design is done right, in my opinion, then that core gameplay is always fundamentally the same, right? Because hopefully your game designer hasn't designed the abilities so that if they choose this power, then the game is suddenly about something completely different, right? Your stealth game suddenly turns into some kind of action swimming game or something weird like that. That would be a nightmare. But instead, all the powers in Breach Wizards and in Dishonored 2, they're all designed to add new layers to the stealth game that you're already playing, right? And that's why accommodating for all those powers isn't always as nightmarish as it might seem. Even though I will say possess in Dishonored is a bit of a nightmare. And there was loads of situations that we had to think about in terms of like, what if the player possesses this character and then walks them all along all the way to the other side of the level and unpossesses them in front of this character who doesn't like that character, or would think it was really, or maybe doesn't hate the character but would think it's really strange that they're there. What should they say? All those kind of things. Possess was a bit of a nightmare because you can do some really wild things with that kind of have narrative implications, I suppose. That's why it gets complicated and expensive. But otherwise, everything else was about the core stealth and action gameplay. Whew. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that was useful and has some relevance to some games that you might be working on, because, like I say, I think that there's loads of games where you can choose all these powers, and I think the key takeaways for me is that, like, don't always assume that the task you're given is as complicated as you might think. You don't have to necessarily think about a million different ideas or test every single possibility. Sometimes it's simpler than that. And whenever it is, you should look for the simple way to approach things, because it's going to save you a lot of pain. So yeah, I hope that's useful and that I didn't miss anything that I wanted to say. We'll see in the edits. I hope that's useful. Cheers for watching, and see ya.